All right, so we are picking up with the last section of Judges today, so Judges chapter 17. And as I mentioned last time, with Samson, we finished the stories of the judges in the book of Judges. And the last several chapters of Judges are actually not stories about the judges, they're stories about the condition of Israel at the end of the period of the judges. And so there's basically going to show how twisted and corrupted things have become in Israel over this period of Judges. The period when the judges were sent by God to rescue the people when they had gone off and after they'd gone through several cycles of this cycle of apostasy, and they've become really, really twisted. And so there's a phrase that you'll see in the beginning and the end of this section to kind of bracket off this section of Judges that says, "In those days Israel had no king, everyone did as they saw fit." And so the author of Judges, whoever's writing Judges, is portraying the situation as being the people partially because they have no leadership, they don't have a centralized leadership that's leading them in following God. And they don't follow what God tells them to do. They all just do whatever they think is best. Everyone does whatever they think is right, whatever is right in their own eyes, but however they think they should act as they see fit, that's what they do, instead of doing what God says, obeying God's commands, following God's law. And so that is the kind of summary description of what's going on in these last several stories in Judges. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. So we have this series of stories that is going to show how twisted and messed up things have gotten in Israel. And not only that people are doing things that are wrong, but they're doing these things and they seem to think that they are right, that they think that they're doing the right thing as they do it. And that comes up pretty clearly in the first story. There's a man named Micah. And Micah has stolen a bunch of money from his mother. He's stolen a bunch of his mother's silver. And he hears her complain and curse about this missing silver that has been stolen and taken from her. It's about 28 pounds of silver that's been stolen, so it's a pretty substantial amount. So there's this 28 pounds of silver that Micah has stolen from his mother, and he hears her cursing about it, complaining about it, griping about it, and he feels bad about it, so he brings the money back to his mother, the silver back to his mother, and gives it back to her. Well, his mom is so happy and feels so much gratitude that her son has brought the silver back that she takes the silver and dedicates it to God, dedicates it to Yahweh, so consecrates it to the Lord in gratitude. And part of what she's going to do because of her gratitude and her consecrating the silver to the Lord is separate out a big portion of it and give it back to Micah to make an idol out of. Now, think through for a second why that would be a problem. Right. They're not supposed to make an idol at all, much less to worship it. And they're not supposed to make any graven images. They're not supposed to make any idols, and they're not supposed to worship anything except for God. And so this woman, this Micah, steals his mother's silver, and when he gives it back, she's so grateful that she dedicates it to God, and things are so messed up in Israel that she thinks what she's supposed to do when she dedicates the silver to God is make an idol from it and break the first two of the Ten Commandments. And so Micah does exactly what his mother suggested. He's stolen the money and he gives it back, and she dedicates it all to God and gives a portion of it back to Micah to make an idol. And he makes this idol and brings it into his house and sets up a shrine for it inside his home, and he and his family begin to worship it. And then one day, a Levite is passing through. And remember, Levites they're from the tribe of Levi. That is the tribe that is dedicated to teaching and instructing the people in the law and to the upkeep and care of the tabernacle. And so this late Levite is passing by, but he is not a priest. He is not from the family of Aaron, even though all priests are supposed to be from the tribe of Levi. Not all Levites are priests. Only those that are descended from Aaron can be priests. And so this is not a Levite from Aaron's family. This is just another Levite, another one of the tribe that is dedicated to teaching people and the general spiritual care and upkeep of the tabernacle. And so this Levite comes passing by, and Micah sees that this Levite is coming by, and he goes and he asks the Levite to come and live in his home, and he will pay him so much silver a year to be their priest for this idol that he has just made out of silver. And the Levite agrees. And so now we have a Levite who is not allowed to be a priest, serving as a priest to an idol that is made from silver that was consecrated to God after having been stolen and returned. We're at least 4 levels of messed up here. And so the Levite moves into Micah's house, and he serves the family as their personal priest before this idol that they've made from the silver consecrated to God. And things go pretty well for a little while, at least. Micah and his family really come to love this Levite, really adopt him as a member of the family, and they're content for a while. But then a group of Danites come by, and the Danites are people of the tribe of Dan, so they're from one of the other Israelite tribes. And this is a group of scouts that are going through and trying to find somewhere for the Danite tribe to attack and take as land for themselves and settle in. And so this tribe of Danites comes, or this group of Danites from the tribe of Dan comes through, these scouts come through, and they see this Levite serving as a priest before this idol. And so they start asking him, why are you here and what are you doing? And the Levite kind of explains what happens in a situation. And the Danites, instead of saying, you're really not supposed to be serving as a priest, and especially not to an idol, that's not really what God wants. Instead, they say, you could come and work for us, and instead of being the priest to one family, you could be a priest to an entire tribe. And so they kind of start talking to this Levite about moving up in the world, and advancing his career, being a priest for a whole tribe instead of one family. And the Danites leave, and they go off, and they continue their scouting mission, and they find where they want to go, and they come back, and as they're coming back through, and they come back to Micah's house, they go in to talk to the Levite again, and they fully convince him to leave Micah's house, Micah's family, and to come with them and serve as a priest to all of the tribe of Dan when they settle in their new home. But they also convince him that it would be that he should steal the idol and all of Micah's idols and bring those with him for the tribe of Dan to worship as well. And so he does. He steals this man's idol that is precious to him and his family after having been accepted as a member of their family and treated like a son in the household. He steals their property, steals their idol, and runs away with the Danites. Well, Micah finds out and chases them down and is begging for this Levite to come back, not understanding why he's been betrayed, or to at least return his idols, the stuff that they've stolen. And the Danites eventually just tell Micah to either go home or they're going to kill him. If he keeps following them and chasing after them, they're going to turn and attack him. And so Micah goes back home, and the Danites, with their new Levite priest, not supposed to be a priest, they rejoin the main group of the Danites, and they go to this place that the scouts had found that seems ideal. And the thing is that this place that they're going to, the place that the scouts found, is not inside the lands that they were supposed to get. It's not in the lands that Dan was supposed to receive. And the people that live there, they don't have any close alliances with anybody else in the area, but they also have never done anything to the Israelites. They're generally a content and peaceful people. But the Danites want their land. And so the Danites, with this Levite, go in and attack and kill all of this relatively peaceful people that is outside of their ancestral lands without any approval from God, and they kill them off and live in their land, take their land, and set up Micah's idols, and this Levite serves them as a priest. And so that's our first sweep, showing the corruption, how messed up things have gotten in Israel. We have a man that steals silver from his mother and returns it, and his mother consecrates that silver to the Lord, and then thinks the thing that she's supposed to do with consecrated silver is make an idol. And so she gives a chunk of it to her son to make an idol from. He begins to worship that idol with his family, breaking the first 2 of the 10 commandments, and then hires a Levite that is not of the tribe of Aaron to be a priest for his family to worship this idol. And then the Danites come through, convince this Levite to leave Micah's family and steal the idols so that they can go and murder off an entire people group and steal their land. That's the first sweep. And then we have a second sweep of stories that end up being interconnected. The Levite and concubine through the lives for the Benjamites are all interconnected stories. We have a totally different Levite, separate guy, and this Levite has a concubine. A concubine is basically a sex slave. It's a servant or a slave that's owned by a man, and he sleeps with her. And so that's a concubine. And so this Levite has a concubine, and the concubine has run away. And so the concubine has run away from the Levite and gone back to her own family, which is apparently outside of Israel. And so the Levite goes back to this concubine's family to demand her back. And they go, and the father of the family recognizes that he has to give her back, but tries to delay them leaving for as long as possible. But eventually the Levite says, no, we're going, and leaves. And the Levite and his concubine start to travel back to their home, but it's a more than 1 day journey. And they pass over a couple of cities along the way because they're not in the tribe of, or they're not one of the Israelite tribes. They're not in Israel. And they eventually come to the land of the tribe of Benjamin, and they find a particular city, and they go and they stay in that city. And when they come in, they go in and they begin to look for somewhere to stay, but no one invites them in. No one will give them a room to stay in. And so the Levite and his concubine begin to set up to sleep overnight in the city square. Well, finally, an old man coming back in at the end of the day sees this Levite and his concubine setting up to sleep in the middle of the city and having not been invited to anybody's home, and so he invites them to come and stay at his house. And so he brings them to his house, and they share a meal together, and then later in the evening, some of the men of the city come and start pounding on this Levite, or the man's door where the Levite and his concubine are staying, and demand that the man bring out this Levite so that the men of the city can rape him.
Sounds familiar.
It does sound familiar. It should sound familiar. If you remember back in Genesis, when Lot and his family had settled in Sodom, God comes to speak to Abraham, and then two angels go ahead and go into Sodom. And while they're there, they stay with Lot, and the men of the city come and demand that Lot bring them out so that they can rape the angels. And that story, the story with Lot, continues on that after a discussion outside involving offering his two virgin daughters to be raped in the city instead, the angels reach out, grab Lot, and then strike all the men blind, and then help Lot and his family escape from the raining fire that God is going to judge the city with the next day. And so God ends up destroying the city. Well, the story changes a little bit here. A lot of the details are the same up till now, but here things change a little bit. The man only has one daughter, and so instead of offering his two virgin daughters, the man offers his virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine. And there's no angels to strike anybody blind or to pull people back into safety, and so the men actually do end up taking the concubine. And they take the concubine out of the man's house, and they take her and they rape her all night long. And they abuse her so badly, in fact, that she crawls back to the house that her master's staying in, and knocks and tries to get in, knocks on the door, but they won't answer the door because of fear of the men outside. And the woman actually dies in the threshold before morning, dies in the threshold of the house before morning. And the next morning, when they get up, the Levite comes out, opens the door to try to find his concubine, and sees her there laying in the threshold, and is at first just kind of brusquely telling her to get up and get ready. It's time for them to leave. And then he figures out that she's dead, not just sleeping. And so he's angry because the men of the city have killed his concubine, which he is apparently thinking of primarily as property. And so he is angry that the people of the city have killed his concubine, and so he takes her body and carries her back to his home. And then he cuts her body into 12 pieces and sends one piece to each of the 12 tribes with a messenger, telling them basically what had happened and that they need to assemble and deal with the city. And so he uses the parts of this woman's body as a kind of rallying cry to get the people of Israel to gather and to attack the city. And they all get together, and he explains what happens. The members representatives from each of the 12 tribes come together, and they're outraged that such a terrible, horrible thing has happened in Israel, and they determine that this city has to be killed. Everybody in the city has to be killed. The whole city is going to be wiped out. And so these other tribes all gather together and go and determine to attack this city inside of Benjamin. Well, the people of Benjamin see one of their cities about to be attacked, and they all assemble to defend the city. And so all of the warriors in Benjamin assemble to defend the city, and we end up with a very bloody, short civil war between the tribe of Benjamin and all the other tribes over this city. And tens of thousands of Israelite soldiers on each side are killed, but eventually this city is wiped out, is destroyed. The other tribes are victorious, and this city is destroyed and wiped out. But along the way, the people of all of the other tribes, in their anger at the tribe of Benjamin for opposing them, destroying the city after the evil that they had done, all of the other tribes, the men of the other tribes, swear an oath not to allow the women in their tribes to be married to the tribe of Benjamin. And so none of the daughters of any of the other tribes can be given in marriage to the Benjamites. And they're not supposed to marry within the tribes. They're supposed to be trying to marry across tribe lines to keep from, too much inbreeding. And so they make this oath, and then all of the other nations, after they've calmed down all the other tribes, after they've calmed down from their anger, they realize that swearing that oath now means that the tribe of Benjamin can't get any wives for themselves, because they're not supposed to marry outside of Israel, and they're not supposed to marry within their own tribe. And so now they have nowhere to get wives, and so they won't be able to have any more children, and this is going to wipe out the tribe of Benjamin in a generation. And so they regret and repent of their oath, but they can't break their oath. They made a solemn oath before God. They can't break this oath. And so what are they going to do? And so they're trying to figure out what to do. And so they call this conclave. All of the families and all the clans of all the tribes are supposed to come together, except for Benjamin. Benjamin's on the out still, but they're trying to figure out what to do about the Benjamites. And so they call all the clans of all the other tribes together to try to figure out, what do we do about these Benjamites? And there's one clan that doesn't send anybody. Nobody comes from this clan. They don't show up. And so all of the other clans and tribes get together and decide that not showing up was just an egregious error, that this is not okay. This tribe or this clan is not allowed to not show up when they've been called this way. And so because of that, they're going to be destroyed, wiped out. But conveniently, instead of just killing off all of them, they will kill off all of the men and all of the older women, but all of the young women that have never slept with a man, they'll capture them and give them to the Benjamites as wives. And so they go in and they wipe out this city and capture about 300 young women and just hand them over to the Benjamites to marry as they see fit. That's not enough women for an entire tribe, though. That's not enough young women to marry to all of the young men in the tribe of Benjamin and keep them going. And so they see this as progress, but they need to do something else. And so they arrange with the young men in the tribe of Benjamin. They say, there is a harvest festival coming up. There's this feast or festival coming up. And during this festival, it's traditional for in a lot of these cities, a lot of our towns, it's traditional for the young unmarried women to go out and dance through the fields with tambourines, and to just kind of make merry and be joyful and dance through the fields. And so during that festival, you young men of Benjamin that don't have a wife, go and hide yourself in these fields. And when a young woman that you like comes by, just grab her and run. Kidnap her and take her home to be your wife. And all of the men, all of these other tribes say that we will go, and when the families get upset about their daughters being kidnapped and carried off to be forced to be married to the Benjamites, we'll go and smooth it over with them and tell them that this is necessary because we all swore this oath not to marry to the Benjamites willingly, and so we have to do this so that the Benjamites can have wives. And that's what happens. The Benjamite young men go and hide themselves out in the fields around this harvest festival, and they start kidnapping young women left and right and carrying them off and forcing them to get married. And when their families complain, the rest of the tribes come in and pressure the families to giving up getting their daughters back. And so the Benjamites get wives. And that's the end of Judges. And so that's, here's how messed up things have gotten in Israel. Everyone does what is right in their own eyes. Everyone does as they see fit. And that doing what they see fit means consecrating silver and making idols, and taking territory that doesn't belong to them, and murdering the inhabitants there, even when they haven't been violent or done anything against Israel. It means reenacting and doing everything that the most corrupt and hideous city in Israel's memory, in Sodom, repeating all the sin of Sodom in their own towns. So everything that happened in Sodom is now, all the corruption of Sodom is now inside Israel, being done by one of the tribes of Israel. And then treating the woman that is killed in that horrid situation, that horrid act, treating her as her body as a kind of call to arms, and cutting her up and mailing her to the 12 corners of Israel, and then taking vengeance against a tribe and swearing a bad oath that they correct by enabling and giving an approval and a rubber stamp to mass kidnapping of young women. Everyone does what is right in their own eyes. And so this is what they think is right. This is how corrupt Israel has become, that these are the things that they justify and have become okay with. And so the point of these stories at the end of Judges is to show how twisted and messed up Israel has become. And that it's no longer enough. They're no longer okay just on their own without a central leader. God, the intention, as we'll see when we get into Samuel's story, the intention was that Israel would need no central king because God was their king. God gave them commandments. God gave them their law. And as long as they would obey God, then they didn't need a central king. They didn't need a central figure that would tax them into poverty and become prideful and create all these other problems. As long as they would follow and obey God, they didn't need a king that would take up all of those resources. But the people have shown that they can't follow God consistently without a central authority figure. And so we have to see about getting a king. And that's the end of the book of Judges. Now, immediately after Judges is the book of Ruth. And we aren't going to deal with Ruth right now. We're going to come back to it. But I want you to know before we leave it, this is the end of the period of the Judges, is the time period that the book of Ruth happens. It's in the last 100 years before the end of the period of the Judges. And so the story of Ruth is going to be taking place during the period when Judges rule. It's kind of at the very beginning of the book of Ruth, actually. And it's going to follow there is a couple from Bethlehem in Judea that during a famine in the land get up and move their family to Moab, which is outside of Israel. And they're going to take the husband and wife and their 2 sons are going to go over and live in Moab. And after a while, the sons are going to get married to Moabite women. And then all of the men, through a series of tragedies, all of the men are going to die. The husband of the woman and their 2 sons are going to die. And it's going to leave this woman and her 2 daughters-in-law. And the woman is going to decide that it's time, there's food back in Bethlehem, there's nothing left for her in Moab, and so she's going to go back home. And one of the 2 daughter-in-laws, named Ruth, will come back with her. And then we'll see the unfolding story of Ruth and her actions in Bethlehem as she tries to take care of her mother-in-law and make sure that her mother-in-law's taken care of and her family's secure. And she'll become, through that process, she's going to become the great-grandmother, great-grandmother to David. So Ruth the Moabite is David's great-grandmother. But again, we'll come back to that story after we get done with the United Monarchy period, after we have heard through Solomon's story, and after our next exam, after the second exam, we'll come back and get Ruth. So that brings us to the beginning of 1 Samuel. And Samuel, the title, the title character for the book, Samuel ends up functioning as kind of the last of the judges and the first of the prophets and the one that anoints the first two kings. And so Samuel is the transition between the period of the judges and the period of the United Monarchy. And there's several important figures in the book, several people that you'll need to know. Samuel is going to get a lot of time. We're going to follow Samuel quite a bit, and then we'll talk about Saul, the first king of Israel, and then David. Once David comes on the scene about midway through the book, he becomes kind of a central character, and we follow him more than anyone else. One thing to know about 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is that originally they were not separate books. Originally they were one story. And so you had the story of Samuel, but there is a limit to how long a scroll could be and still be easy to work with and easy to preserve and keep it from getting damaged. And so the single story Samuel was split into two scrolls, and we end up with 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And so when you're looking at them, just know when you're looking at 1 and 2 Samuel, you're actually looking at one continuous story that has been broken at a particular point for convenience and because it's easier to preserve scrolls that don't get too long and too thick when they're rolled up. And so there's a particular point right at the death of Saul, actually. After the death of Saul, the story is broken into two pieces, and then the next chapter picks up with David's reaction to the death of Saul. And so the 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel are one book split into two for the sake of convenience and preservation. And that's not just true for 1 and 2 Samuel, it's true for 1 and 2 Kings, which is the next two books in the Old Testament, which picks up with the story of Solomon after the death right at the end of David's life. And follows through the history of the divided kingdom until the fall of both Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And so the 1 and 2 Kings was originally just the book of the annals of the kings, and it was split into two because of scroll length. And then the same is also true for 1 and 2 Chronicles, which was originally the Chronicles of Judah, and follows a kind of an abbreviated version of the story from like Noah all the way down through the end of the kingdom of Judah. And it was originally one book and is split into two, and so we now have 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. But in each of those cases, all of these Old Testament books that have a first and a second, they were originally one, and then were split into two for convenience and for preservation's sake. Not true in the New Testament. When you have a 1 and 2 in the New Testament, it's not the same thing. Those are actually usually separate letters but in this case, in the Old Testament, it's all one book that gets split into two. And so the first character that we're introduced to in Samuel is Hannah. And Hannah is going to be Samuel's mother, but at the beginning of the story, in the first chapter of Samuel, Hannah is a woman that has been married to a good man for a long time. They have a very good relationship, but she's never been able to get pregnant. And the man that she's married to is also married to another woman. He has two wives, and the other woman has been able to have children and makes Hannah's life kind of miserable because Hannah's the favorite wife, but can't have children, and so she's getting back at her however she can, because her husband doesn't like her as well, or whatever. And so Hannah is, the whole family has come to the tabernacle, to the city that the tabernacle is kept in, and she is inside the tabernacle praying at the beginning of the story. And she's praying in a way that she's begging God to be able to have a child, to be able to get pregnant. And she promises God that if God will allow her to conceive and have a son, she will give that son back to God to serve him, to serve God all the days of his life. And as she's praying this, as she's in the tabernacle, she's really like pouring her heart out. I mean, she's really fervently, intensely praying. She's moving her mouth and she's kind of whispering as she's praying. So she's actually kind of verbalizing her prayer instead of just doing it internally while kneeling. And so she's moving her mouth and some sounds are coming out. And so the priest at the time, Eli the priest comes through and sees this woman inside the tabernacle with her mouth moving and sound coming out, but he can't understand what she's saying. And he assumes, instead of it's a woman here praying, he assumes that she's gotten drunk and wandered into the tabernacle. And so he goes and confronts her and basically tells her, what are you doing here drunk in the tabernacle? You shouldn't be here. Get out. And Hannah replies and tells him, basically, no, I'm not drunk. I haven't been drinking. I'm praying and pouring out my heart to God and asking Him to give me what I asked for. And Eli, probably kind of embarrassed that he had just gone out and accused this woman of being drunk in the tabernacle instead of talking to her and finding out what was going on. He blesses her and says, basically, may you find favor with the Lord and may He grant your request, and leaves. And sure enough, shortly thereafter, they go home and she conceives and is pregnant, and she celebrates. And in 1 Samuel chapter 2, the first half of the chapter is the Song of Hannah, and it's her big Thanksgiving song or Thanksgiving poem to God, where she praises God and thanks God for all the good things that He has done for her. And she specifically prays some of the things that she says in the song. Lift up some themes that are going to be picked up by the rest of our story. Specifically, one of the big things that she says in the song that is picked up as a theme is that God lifts up the humble but opposes the proud. And so God is against those who are prideful, but He supports and helps those who are humble. And we'll see that through the rest of the story of this united monarchy, the kings of Israel, the United Kingdom, the life of the kings, or the reign of the kings, follows this kind of arc where they have kind of humble beginnings, things that they start either from a position of weakness or from volatility or from obscurity, and the kingdom grows and solidifies, and they do really well, things go really well until they start doing something they shouldn't. They start messing up, they either get proud and prideful and start thinking they can do things their own way and not listen to what God says, or they do something really abundantly stupid or just evil, and things start to fall apart, and there's a decline to their kingdom. And so their reign ends badly. And this is true for, as we'll see in 1 Samuel, we're going to see the full sweep of the first king, Saul, first king of Israel. We'll see Saul begin in kind of obscurity and rise up to become king and unite all the different tribes. But at a particular moment, he will get fearful and not wait on God, and so try to jump ahead and do something that he shouldn't, take the role of a priest. And then later, he will be told by God to kill a particular king, and instead he decides to make a treaty with him that will make him rich. And so he disobeys God, and this is the beginning of the end for Saul. And so Saul's kingdom deteriorates and collapses until eventually Saul is killed in battle along with his son. And then David, in the midst of that, as Saul's kingdom, after he makes his big mistake and the descent of his kingdom begins, God tells Samuel to anoint David to be king, and we'll see David's rise to prominence and power. And as Saul is killed, David becomes king and unites the kingdom and makes the kingdom even greater and more impressive and powerful than it was, and does several amazing things. But then at a particular moment, he messes up big time. In fact,
adultery?
Yeah, he commits adultery with a woman that is the wife of one of his closest supporters, one of his best friends. He commits adultery with the wife of one of his best friends, and then has the friend killed in order to cover up his adultery. And that is the beginning of the end of his prominence. And after that, both his kingdom and his family, and the intermix between the two, his kingdom and family together, begin to crumble, collapse, fall apart, and his relatively peaceful, prosperous part of his reign is over. And so his reign will decline until, at the very, very end of his life, his son Solomon is made king in very difficult circumstances, and then David dies. And so the cycle for the shape of the story for each of these kings is rise from obscurity to prominence, because they are doing what God tells them to do. They're acting in the power of God, but then they do something that they shouldn't. They defy God. They don't wait on God. They commit adultery and murder. And after that, things begin to crumble and fall apart for them. So you see that shape of the story for both Saul and David, and then later in 1 Kings, you'll see a similar thing. It's a little more hidden, a little harder to see for Solomon, but the same shape is there for Solomon in 1 Kings. So we see the shape of that story, and it's kind of foreshadowed, at least in Hannah's song in 1 Samuel chapter 2. The agreement, what Hannah promises to God is that she will, if God will allow her to conceive and have a son, she will offer that son back to the Lord as to set him apart for God all the days of his life. And the way that actually works out is that Hannah raises Samuel until he's old enough to be weaned and old enough to be away from his mother, not like grown, but probably say 6 or 7 years old, somewhere around there. He's a boy, and so at that point, Hannah hands him over to Samuel to be raised in the temple. And so the boy Samuel is taken to the tabernacle and finished raising by Eli inside the tabernacle. And he serves Eli and does whatever Eli needs done, Samuel does it. And as he grows, he becomes more and more able to do the things that Samuel asks him to do. And then eventually there is an evening, there's a night where Samuel is in bed, the boy Samuel is in bed, and he hears a voice calling out his name. He says, Samuel, Samuel. And so he naturally thinks that it's Eli calling out to him. And so he jumps up and runs to Eli's room and says, hey, did you call me? What can I do? What do you need? And Eli is waking up all groggy and has no idea what's going on. He says, I didn't call you, go back to bed. And so Samuel goes back to bed, and a little while later, the voice calls out again, Samuel, Samuel. And so he runs and goes back to Eli's room and says, did you call me? What do you need? And Eli says again, I didn't call you, go back to bed. And it happens a third time. The voice calls out a little later, Samuel, Samuel. He runs to Eli's bedroom. He says, look, what do you need? Did you call me? And Eli at this point has figured out something's going on, and he thinks, well, maybe God is trying to talk to the boy. And so he tells Samuel to go back to his bedroom, to go back to lay down, and the next time that the voice speaks, instead of running to find Eli, he should respond, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And so, assume that it's God talking to you, trying to speak to you, and respond to God by saying, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And so Samuel goes back to bed. Sure enough, the voice speaks again a little while later, and he replies and says, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And so God speaks to him and calls him and tells him what he's going to end up doing, what God is going to use him to do. But as a part of that telling Samuel what's about to happen, what God is going to use him to do, he gives Samuel some bad news for Eli and his family. One of the things that I kind of skipped over, the last half of chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, is a description of Eli's 2 sons. And Eli was overall a good priest and a pretty good dude. But he was extremely weak when it came to taking care of and dealing with his 2 sons. And so because Eli is a priest, his 2 sons are in the line for the priesthood, and they are serving as priests. But they are messed up, wicked, corrupted priests. And they do things, on one end of the scale, they do things like manipulating the way that the sacrifices are done so that the priests always are supposed to get, for most kinds of sacrifices, the priests get a portion of the meat from the animal, and that's their livelihood. That's what they eat. That's how they survive. Well, these 2 sons are manipulating the sacrifices, so instead of getting the portion that they are supposed to get, they keep the portion that God is supposed to get because they like the way it tastes better. And so they manipulate the sacrifices so that they can get the part that they want against the law regarding the way the sacrifices are supposed to be made. And so that's one end of their corruption, one thing that they do. But also another thing, and worst thing that they do, is they use their position as priests to bully and manipulate young women into sleeping with them. And so they are committing spiritual abuse by using their spiritual authority to get sexual favors. And so they bully these and manipulate these young women into sleeping with them. And so God sees this, and Eli has seen this, their father has seen this, and he has confronted them over it, but he hasn't actually done anything to stop them. And so Eli, overall, in his own right, has been a pretty good priest, But now he has raised his sons, and now that his sons are adults and they're serving as priests, he doesn't have the fortitude or whatever it is that he needs to go and genuinely put a stop to what his sons are doing and strip them from the priesthood or deal with them in any real way. He kind of swats them on the hand and says, now, and then goes on about his business and lets his son keep doing what they're doing. And so God tells Samuel in this overnight conversation, when Samuel finally responds to him, God tells Samuel that Eli and his two sons are going to die. They're going to be killed, and Samuel is going to end up performing the services that Eli performs now. And so Samuel is going to end up serving as a kind of priest and is going to serve as this judge over Israel. And so Samuel gets up the next morning and he goes back to sleep. He gets up the next morning and really doesn't want to talk to Eli, because if he talks to Eli, then he might have to tell him about what God told him, and that he and his sons are going to get killed. But Eli sent Samuel to bed, knowing full well that God might speak to him, and so he quickly calls Samuel in and begs him or insists that Samuel tell him what God said. And so Samuel does, and Eli's response appropriately is, "He is the Lord." If that's what he says and that's what he's determined, then so be it. And so the next story is going to be the death of Eli's two sons. And it's the way it works out is some of the Israelites, some of the people of Israel have decided that it's time to go up and fight the Philistines, to go to war with the Philistines. And so they determine they're going to go and fight against the Philistines. They're going to go to war with them, and they don't ask God. They don't consult God. They don't pray. They don't seek the word of the Lord. But they want God's protection in the battle, and they want God to assure their victory. So they haven't asked God whether they're supposed to go or how they're supposed to go about the battle, but they still want God to bless the battle. And so they decide they're going to get the two sons of Eli to carry the Ark of the Covenant in front of the army and treat the Ark of the Covenant as like a magic good luck charm. And so it's like, this is God's magic box, and if we carry that, God will give us the victory. And so the two sons of Eli take up the Ark of the Covenant, and they carry it in front of the armies, and they go to fight against the Philistines, and the people are just certain they're going to win because the Ark of the Covenant goes before them. They do not win. The Philistines trounce them, and a lot of the Israelites die, including Eli's two sons. The two sons of Eli carrying the Ark of the Covenant die in the battle, and not only that, but the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant and take it into Philistine territory. And in fact, they take it and they put it in the temple of their god Dagon as a kind of trophy to how big and bad and powerful their god is, to show, their army defeated the army of the Israelites with this talisman of their god in their midst. And even so, they won. Dagon gave them the victory over the God of the Israelites, and so now they're putting the Ark of the Covenant in the temple of Dagon as a kind of trophy to the greatness of Dagon. Well, a messenger from the battle runs back and starts telling the Israelites what happened, and when the message gets to Eli, and he hears his two sons are dead, he kind of has a meh reaction. He doesn't react very much to the death of his two sons, but then he's told that the Ark of the Covenant was captured in battle and carried off by the Philistines, and he is so jarred by that he actually falls off of his chair and breaks his neck and dies. And so Eli and his two sons die on the same day, and the Ark of the Covenant is carried off by the Philistines. At this point, the scene switches, the story switches, and we're going to follow the Ark of the Covenant for a little bit. The Ark of the Covenant, as I said, has been put in the temple of Dagon in front of the idol of Dagon, and it's there as a kind of trophy to the immense, enormous power of Dagon, that he has given the Philistines the victory, even though the Ark of the Covenant of the Israelites was there at the battle. And so they put the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, and they leave and they go about their business. They come back the next morning, and the idol of Dagon has fallen over on its face, looking like it's bowing to the Ark of the Covenant. And so the idol of Dagon has fallen over on its face before the Ark of the Covenant. Well, this seems like a bad sign, and they're not sure what to make of it, so they set the idol of Dagon back up. And again, they go on about their business, and they leave, and then they come back the next morning, And the idol of Dagon has fallen over again and has once again fallen over in front of the Ark of the Covenant. But this time, not only has it fallen over, but its hands have shattered and broken off, and its head broke off and rolled all the way to the threshold of the temple. And so now they're really freaked out. In fact, the text mentions that there's a tradition among the Philistines that remained in the worship of Dagon that no one would step on the threshold on their way in. They would step over it because the head of Dagon rolled into the entry to the doorway, into the threshold. And so not only, along with the destruction of the idol, or the breaking of this idol of Dagon, the city has also started to experience some other problems. People are growing these huge tumors on their skins, like the outside of their body. They're growing these big tumors on the outside of their body. And the city has suddenly started to experience an infestation of rats that are devouring, getting into all of their stores, their food stores, and devouring up all their grain and ruining all their stores. And eventually, I mean, the broken idol of Dagon and all of the tumors that are growing on their bodies and the infestation of rats, they put it all together and they decide that this is all happening because they have the Ark of the Covenant here. They should not have taken it, and they need to get rid of it. And so they put it in a cart and send it off and ship it off to another town in the Philistine territory. And so they send it to another city or another town of the Philistines, and this other city accepts it and takes it in. And very shortly thereafter, they start having all the same problems. They're growing tumors. People in the city are growing tumors, and now all of a sudden they have this rat infestation in their city. And so they connect it back to the Ark of the Covenant, and they decide, yeah, we got to get rid of it too. And so they send it off to another town. Well, when it arrives at the third town, the third town says, yeah, we heard what happened in the first two towns, and we don't want it. And so the Philistines, a lot of the cities in the area get together, and they get some of the priests together from the Philistines, and they try to figure out what to do, and they decide the best thing to do is just to cut our losses and send the ark back. Send the ark back to Israel. But the priests say, we can't just send the ark back to Israel. That's not going to work. If we're sending it back because of all this bad stuff happening, and we want the bad stuff to stop, we need to send the ark back with a gift. And so they decide they're going to put a chest, a kind of a treasure chest, beside the Ark of the Covenant, and they're going to fill the treasure chest up with little golden models of the rats and the tumors. And so they fashion golden tumors and put those in the box, and then they fashion golden rats, and they put the golden rats in the box, and they send that back with the Ark of the Covenant. And they also try to, just in case this all happens to be a coincidence, they arrange this system so that if it's not really God doing all this stuff, not really the God of the Israelites doing all this stuff, the ark will come back. So they put the ark and this box full of golden gifts in an ox cart, and they put 2 oxen in the front of it to pull it and take it back to the Israelites. But they don't have anybody driving the cart, and the two oxen they choose are females that have just given birth. They have just very recently given birth, and they take the calves that were born and put them in a pen and separate them from their mother, and then they send the driverless cart with the 2 mother oxen off. And the thought is that if this is not God doing this, then the natural impulse of the 2 mother oxen is going to be to turn around and come back to the pen where their babies are, because 1, maternal instinct, and 2, they're nursing, and it's going to start hurting if they don't get suckled on. They'll produce such milk it'll hurt, and they'll want to come back. And so they send off these oxen with their calves left behind, and sure enough, before very long, the oxen are lowing and mooing and making all this terrible racket, but they don't stop and turn around. They make a beeline for Israel. They keep going, but they're making this horrible racket the whole time because they're fighting their instincts to go where God is pushing them to go. And so the Ark of the Covenant on this cart rolls its way back into Israel, back into a particular town. And the people see it coming, and they start celebrating. They take apart the cart that the Ark of the Covenant is on, and they build an altar and put the wood on top to make a fire, and they kill the 2 oxen and sacrifice the 2 oxen as an offering to God. And there's big celebration. But some people do some stupid stuff and try to look inside the ark and die too. So don't try to look inside the ark. If you haven't seen Indiana Jones, watch Indiana Jones, and then know you don't look inside the ark. It comes back. Now, the thing to note about this story is that, 1, the Israelites tried to use the ark as their kind of magic good luck charm to make sure that they won the battle. and God did not let them do that. God calls them to lose the battle and to lose the ark. But then also note that God defeated the Philistines anyway. He just did it himself and without an army, and brought the ark back into Israel without any Israelites being involved. And so on the one hand, this is showing that the Israelites can't just manipulate God and use God's power without obeying God's commands. If they're willing to follow God, God will give them success in what he's telling them to do. But if they just try to use God for their own ends and do whatever they want and say this, God is with us, that's never going to work for them. But on the other hand, it's also showing that God doesn't really need the Israelites to get victory. He can do it himself anytime and in any way that he wants to, even with rats and tumors. That's the end of the time we have today. We'll pick up with the coronation of King Saul and get into the lifetime of Saul and David's story as well on Wednesday.